To the Point with Michael Williams.
2019 was a good year for the stock market, but what can we expect for 2020? How could the growing tensions with Iran affect the market? What can we anticipate for the coming year when it comes to buying homes and finding jobs? Good Sunday morning. I'm John Shainman in for Michael Williams today. Welcome to our first show of the year 2020. And one of the issues that affects everybody is the economy. I'm talking with two people who have some insight on what we should be looking for in the coming year. They are Greg McBride, the chief financial analyst at Bankrate.com, and Dave Wentley, a financial advisor. Thank you, gentlemen, both for coming in this morning. Greg, I want to start with you. You know, one of the questions on the top of minds this weekend is what kind of effect do you think this airstrike that just took place could have on the economy, maybe specifically with oil prices?
Pushing up oil prices for sure. Oil prices have been depressed for the past few years, and that's given the consumer a little bit more spending power. If that's sustained, that is a bit of a headwind for consumer spending, but I don't see this as something that derails the continued growth in the economy. I think when we look back at year end, this is one of those things like, oh yeah, that's right, that was this year.
That happened. Dave, again, 2019, a great year. This is kind of one of those news moments where everybo's wondering what will we see in the markets. How do you see it moving?
Nobody can really predict what's going to happen in a given year because things can change so quickly. The airstrike certainly being one of them. Geopolitical risks are always going to be part of the economy, part of the global everything that we're involved in. So it is something that bears watching. But right now, if you look at Wall Street, they're watching it, but they're not really overreacting to it. And Greg is absolutely right. You keep an eye on oil prices because oil has been really, really low. The price for gas have been low the last couple of years, putting more money in our pockets. We don't want to see that change dramatically.
Is it something that we could see happen in a month from now, 2 months from now? I mean, again, you said we can't predict really essentially what happens tomorrow, but when these events happen, do we see something down the road? Is there a point that we should look forward to or look at in particular?
I think you have to just day to day. It's kind of because it's going to move. A lot of these things happen in fits and starts, particularly when we're dealing with Iran. I'm hoping cooler heads prevail. And as Greg said, this is something we're going to look back on and go, oh yeah, that happened in January.
So Greg, you don't think that something that happens January 1st, January 2nd will impact us perhaps in December?
Well, if you're waiting for world peace and harmony to invest, you're never going to invest, right? So a lot of this, you do kind of have to block it out. Things that seem incredibly significant in the investing realm turn out not to be so. So in terms of things to watch the broader economy. If we saw consumer spending pull back in a measurable way, that's trouble, because it's the consumer that is the pillar on which the economy rests.
So before this attack, heading into 2020, what were you guys looking at? Will this year perhaps be a stronger year, weaker year, about the same? Anything you saw that you looked at?
In terms of the economy, just slow, steady growth, more or less 2%. We've got this virtuous cycle right now of low unemployment. Consumers are working, they're making more money, and they're spending. And that consumer spending is the pillar on which the economy rests. You get any disruption in that, that's when we have to start, to refigure things, right? But as long as unemployment's at a 50-year low, as long as people are working, they have jobs, and they're spending money, the economy is going to continue to chug along. Other distractions notwithstanding.
Dave, were any of your clients looking at the big picture coming into 2020? Were they saying anything in particular to you?
What they often do after a really good year, and last year was a surprisingly good year, is, we always take a certain amount of money out of my retired clients for income for the next year or so. So we're kind of looking at taking more than a year just to take advantage of the fact that we do have better gains this year. But I'm right along with Greg. I think it's going to be a steady as she goes. I think the economy is going to keep improving. I do not think we're going to see the meteoric rise in the market. I think we will see turbulence, but all in all, I'm optimistic going into this year.
Why do you think 2019 was a good year? You said it was almost like a pleasant surprise.
It was we were talking about this before we came on the air. A year ago, we were very pessimistic as investors because you look at what had just happened. The fourth quarter of 2018 had fallen, and December was among the worst. I think December is going back to the Great Depression. The Fed had tightened money. The China dispute looked like it was accelerating. Okay, where are we? What happened? Where are we today? The Fed corrected its error. They cut rates not once, not twice, but 3 times. We are about to sign a deal for phase 1 of the trade dispute. I think the markets are very happy with that. I don't think inflation really showed its head at all. So I think we have gone from a more pessimistic investing public to a more optimistic.
And talk of a recession seems to have receded, whereas
Correct.
several months ago, as you were talking about with the tariffs, there was a lot of talk about that. But Greg, we haven't heard or seen a lot of headlines about that lately.
No, I mean, a year ago, things were priced for the worst case scenario. And then as Dave pointed out, the reality turned out to be better on almost all those fronts. And a lot of that uncertainty was resolved. One of the big ones, this agreement on phase one, that took a lot of uncertainty off of the market. And that's really what's powered the gain that we saw through year end in the market. So, some of these things are still going to be out there. We're still going to have to look at and worry about weak economic growth overseas. If the trade deal falls apart, that's going to be a headwind. But turbulence is going to be part of it. We're going to have our ups and downs, but as long as the broader economy holds up, I think the market ends the year in a good place.
Let's talk about housing. South Florida seems to continuously grow. Is this a good time to buy a house, a bad time to buy a house, Dave? Or Greg, I'm sorry, let's go to you first. What do you think?
Well, the problem is going to continue to be lack of inventory in those price points, particularly here in South Florida, under $400,000. If you're looking at higher end homes, there's plenty of supply there and plenty of new building taking place. It's the first time home buyer and even some move up buyers that are having a struggle. Good news is mortgage rates are not going to be an impediment this year. I see mortgage rates staying below 4% much of the year, hopscotching back and forth over that 4% threshold, but still staying below 4% or in the low 4s throughout 2020.
Is there a better time to put a house on the market or look for a house during the calendar year in this type of market?
I always look, I think the average home buyer is looking to buy a home to get in to live in. I don't think they're studying, the economics or whatever. I've got two millennial kids. I can see in their own world, their friends are buying houses because they need them. They're having children. They want to live in a nice neighborhood. You're going on and on and on. So I do think it's a good time to be buying. And I think in South Florida, it's always a pretty good time to be selling.
And affordability, again, just for your kids, for example, I mean, have they had to look long and hard to find that right house?
Sadly, yes. Yeah. The price of housing has risen dramatically in South Florida, particularly in the last 10 years.
Greg, you mentioned low unemployment, or Dave, you also mentioned the same thing. So what are we looking at when it comes to finding a job? The market seems to be good right now for that?
It does seem to be good. I mean, you mentioned the continued growth we see in South Florida, and as more and more of our friends come down from up north and buy houses and buy golf memberships, that money makes its way into our economy. We are starting to see more high-paying jobs locally, which again, that is good news as well. So, I talked about that virtuous circle of low unemployment and consumer spending. I think we see that to an even greater degree here in South Florida because of the continued growth that we're seeing.
I know over the years, lawmakers in Tallahassee, our governors, senators, everybody's been pushing Florida. Low taxes, move your business here. I know the business development boards here in Palm Beach County have been trying to attract financial outfits. I mean, that will keep this engine going, Dave, would you say?
I would think so. I think it's one of the most appealing places to live. But I would say yes. I think the environment in terms of business and people coming here is as good as it's been.
In terms of Florida just had a very small, I guess, minimum wage increase. On the other end of the spectrum, on the lower paying jobs, is that going to make a difference? Is that going to help keep the engine going, Greg? What do you think?
It will help somewhat, but what our research is finding is that only about half of employees are getting pay increases in a given year. And less are we seeing the cost of living raise that's across the board. And what we do see more and more each year is that the raises are doled out based on merit, reaching certain performance thresholds, somebody who takes on more responsibilities or gets promoted. So I think that's really the key is, while we see headline wage growth says 3%, the reality is somebody got 6%, somebody else didn't get anything. Right. You've got to position yourself so you're the person who's in demand, who has the skills that employers are rewarding, because it's cheaper to pay you than to try to replace you.
And there's been a lot of talk also about that $15 minimum wage, a living wage, if you will. Is that something? I know it doesn't seem like there's any political appetite for that in Tallahassee. Could that eventually become something down here?
I've got two teenagers in the workforce. I wouldn't pay either one of them $15 an hour, so I hope not.
Well, now, again, that also gets into the growing disparity between the rich and everyone else. Is that going to continue in 2020, Dave?
We're seeing wages rising. Fourth quarter, I think that we're going to look back and see wages rising in the fourth quarter, and that's on the lower working class to middle class. We are seeing them getting pay raises. Is always slow in coming, but I think that will continue. I think that's going to continue. So we're trying to bring down the inequality, but it's very difficult to do. But our hope is that we keep people employed and better educated so that they can rise up and work into the middle class and maybe beyond that.
This is an election year, 2020, a big year. The market's looking at everything, if you will. From years past, from election years past, what have you guys noticed? Do you think things will be the same this year in terms of markets perhaps wanting a divided Washington, if you will? Or would they rather see a one-party leadership? What do you think, Greg?
Well, I think the market is going to move mainly on economic fundamentals for the first 3 quarters of the year. Now, we get into the fourth quarter, late September, and particularly into October. And as the election draws closer, then I think every utterance of the candidates, every headline is going to move markets even more so. But for the first 9 months, I do think politics kind of take a back seat to the economy in terms of what we're seeing out of the market day to day.
Dave, what do you think, 2020?
It's been my experience that the markets oftentimes will prefer one candidate over another. You know, often it's economic policies. But I think at the end, what the market really wants to know is who's going to be occupying the White House, because the market will adjust to whoever is elected and then go look for something else to worry about. So, you know, I do know it prefers one candidate over another from an economic standpoint, but I do think, as it always has, it will adjust.
And as you said, we'll have to see what happens globally, whether or not that affects us domestically, if you will, right? Any one other tidbit as 2020 is here with us right now?
Offhand, I would say if you're putting money away, as many people in your newsroom are, into the 401k, continue to do it. Don't let the short-term ups and downs in the markets, sway it all. Just put the money away and go about enjoying your life.
Good.
Agree with that 100%. Just, buckle your seatbelt. I do expect more volatility this year, so you're going to have to grip the armrest a little bit tighter. But as long as the economy holds up, the market will end the year in a good place.
Dave Wentley, Greg McBride, thank you both so much for coming in and sharing your insights. I hope you both have a fantastic 2020.
Thanks.
Well, coming up, does the strike in Baghdad become the top presidential campaign issue? Our roundtable taking on that and more when we come back. How does the strike in Iraq affect the presidential campaign? Our roundtable is taking on that and more when we come back. Time now for our roundtable with Mariana Mancuso, a Republican political strategist, and News Channel 5 political analyst, Brian Crowley. It's been a while since I've seen these guys. I have to remember. Thank you for both coming in.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to both of you. Okay, well, the U.S. airstrike that just took place the other day killed Iran's top military leader. Does this now become the top issue on the presidential campaign, Brian?
Well, there's no question, at least in the short term. Depending how this plays out, at least in the short term, yeah, it's going to be, in fact, it probably has overcome all the other issues. When you look like you're going to war, that tends to take precedence over everything else. And I'm not saying we're going to war, but right now, as the days play out, and we don't know exactly what Iran's reaction is going to be and what we'll do to react to Iran again, yeah, I don't see how foreign policy doesn't become a top issue.
Mariana.
Absolutely. This has thrust foreign policy right into the spotlight, and we'll start to see some of the candidates talk about it and take position. We've already heard from Congress, and we've seen people go on Twitter and talk about how this needed to be done, but needed congressional blessing and all of these things. And so I think we're going to see a lot of pushback from the Democrats naturally in this hyper-partisan times, but we're going to see the Republicans try and move this football forward.
In terms of what could Iran do in response? Now, we've watched over the last couple of months as Iran has launched rockets at ships in the Persian Gulf and attacks in Saudi Arabia. And so can we defend and say, well, this was us just sort of getting ahead of the game? Or, I mean, how does that, it's sort of a tit for tat, if you will.
Well, I think, I'm mind reading a little bit here, but I think the message that the Trump administration was trying to come out with this attack on this evil, evil man who killed thousands of people, including Americans, he wants to swing the baseball bat at their heads, and that's what he did. And basically, if you come back at us, we're going to hit you harder. And will that work? I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Iranian people, but we're bigger and badder than they are, so I don't think they want to get into too big a conflict. On the other hand, I think overall, Democrats, independents, Republicans, the average person out there, they're weary of the Middle East. We've been involved in war in the Middle East in one way or another since 9/11. Nobody feels like there's been any real progress made. It's always seems to be a mess. We continue to have people killed. You saw what happened to our embassy last week. I think there's a bit of exhaustion with the things that go on in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the rest of the Middle East. I talk to a lot of people who wish we would just get out.
Well, right or wrong, you know, the president's decision, does this keep us in the Middle East, at least through this presidential campaign, or if the president is reelected through another 4 years?
It creates the opportunity, but I think one thing that we have to step back is really understand who this person was that we took out, because a lot of people aren't understanding the geopolitics of it. And what we know is that the way that this is being pitched out in Iran and the way that the Middle Eastern people are talking about it, it's as though somebody came and took out one of our joint chiefs of staff. And if you do that, that is obviously going to elicit a very strong response. And currently what they're talking about over there, they are saying this is a form of American terrorism. And so that could cause a rise and cause a lot of problems for us over there. We already know that they're asking any type of American that are in Iraq to evacuate the state, evacuate the country, come back to America. They're really working on, you know, shuttering up the embassies, and we've already greenlit troops to head over to Kuwait.
Does this put impeachment? You were talking about other things. There are a lot of other things going on in the world. Impeachment. I mean, next week Congress is back in Washington. Impeachment. That was all about November and December. Does that slide to the back burner, or is it too big a topic?
On Friday, the Senate was back in session. They didn't vote or do anything, but they were back in session. Mitch McConnell stood up opening the Senate session, and the first thing he talked about was what happened in Iran, and he spoke about that at some length with this assassination. And then he talked at great length about the impeachment. So I don't think the impeachment's going away, and I'm not convinced it'll take a back seat because it's there. They have to deal with it. But it could be difficult for the Democrats, and particularly, I honestly, I don't understand Nancy Pelosi's holding on to the impeachment, and it could be that people are like, we're in the midst of this potential military crisis, this foreign policy crisis. Doesn't this overshadow playing games with the impeachment? And the Democrats, they probably need to move this thing over to the Senate like now.
Mariana, what do you think?
This should have been done right after they had the articles. There's no need to hold them on, put them in a drawer or anything. We just need to move this forward, either get this done and let's continue on, because as we see, the president's moving forward on foreign policy agenda, and I'll tell you right now, I'm really glad that we're finally taking a focus on foreign policy.
February 4th is when the president's supposed to do his State of the Union. Will we have an impeachment trial before then? What do you think, bro?
It's so hard to predict what's going on. There seems to have been a great absence of logic in a lot of this stuff on both the Republican and the Democratic side on this, and between the House and the Senate. You know, maybe we need to think about in the 2020 election to elect some grown-ups in both parties to be in Congress. So who knows?
February 4th, they'd have to move pretty quick.
Yeah, before that would get in there.
If anything, that's not
at least
something that
send the
happens.
paperwork over.
Yes.
You know,
You mentioned 2020 electing grown-ups. Do you guys think this will have any impact on our congressional races, Marianne?
It's going to be interesting to see if this can maintain a level of momentum. That is not me suggesting we should go to war with Iran. I think that there has to be a level of momentum. This was literally a flash in the pan that took the life of somebody who was very evil, as Brian pointed out. And what happens next, we're going to have to stay vigilant and watch for the next couple
Well,
days.
the other wild card, kind of bouncing off our previous guest, is the economy. You know, we saw the stock market's initial reaction to what happened on Friday, which is not unexpected. But if all of these events start to trigger a big downfall in the economy, then we're back to the #1 issue for everybody. How's my pocketbook look?
The 2020 presidential campaign, we've seen Mike Bloomberg putting out a lot of ads attacking Donald Trump.
Would you kill to be his consultant? The money they're
the money that they're spending. Well, now, I mean, what does he do now? I mean, he's sort of been the outsider trying to gain some access into the top tier, if you will. I mean, again, he's got unlimited funds, it seems, but does he have to end up changing these ads?
No, you know, his strategy is to wait for Super Tuesday, bypass New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina and Nevada, wait for Super Tuesday, do so well in Super Tuesday because the rest of the field is a mess and there's nobody in the lead. And then by the time we get to Florida's primary on March 17th, you know, he'll just roll away as the nominee. Who knows? I mean, if he succeeds, he will have totally disrupted the early primary system. Suddenly New Hampshire and Iowa, they're sweating bullets over this because they don't want Michael Bloomberg to suddenly turn their events into meaningless events.
Yeah, he's waiting for them to cannibalize themselves through New Hampshire and Iowa, and we'll see here in Florida. He's playing a Super Tuesday strategy, and whether people agree with that or disagree with it, that's the reality of it. And we know that while Trump is holding a $100 million war chest, I saw this morning, the reality is that Michael Bloomberg can outspend him easily 2-1.
Mariana, Brian, as always, very insightful. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with more in a moment. Now it's time for our closing comments, and we begin with the Mancuso moment. Mariana?
Last week, the Florida Federation of Young Republicans lost their former chairman, Robbie Foster, and my heart goes out to his friends and family. It was a deep loss for the state, for Florida politics, and Republicans everywhere.
Brian?
You know, my nephew is in the Marine Corps. He's the third generation of Crowleys in the Marine Corps, and one of the things that always bothers me a little bit during these events is politicians who haven't spent a day in the military cheerfully sending, as we're now sending another 3,500 troops to the Middle East. And a lot of our politicians tend to talk really tough, and they didn't spend a day in the military, and that sort of bothers me. On a lighter note, I wish more people could see our Florida director. He's got some of the coolest sneakers I've ever seen.
Because these guys have some great kicks, by the way.
They deserve to be on camera. They're beautiful.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much. We appreciate it. And thank you for spending time with us on today's To The Point. If you'd like to send us your comments about today's broadcast, go to WPTV.com, click on the To The Point page, and you'll see a section to send us your views. Enjoy the rest of your day.